Hi everyone. So on the screen here, you're seeing the worksheet that we have for this week for the confidence intervals. We're on the first week of dealing with them. So we are going to be looking at the one sample confidence intervals. So that's on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, I have a document that I posted on Canvas. And it's a flow chart that kind of guides you through what you should be thinking about for each one of these problems. Okay. What I want to do in this video is I want to go through the worksheet. I'm not going to directly tell you answers or anything, but I want to give you a little bit of guidance about what you should be thinking about for each of the problems. Okay, so looking at the flow chart, okay, the whole flow chart is actually a little bit more. Okay, there's some more stuff over on the left-hand side here, and that's actually stuff from earlier in the course. Okay, so this kind of gives you a frame of reference once you get to the final. This would be good to pull out again. But for this chapter 8, we're specifically going to be looking over on the right-hand side of the screen here. So you're looking at a question. It's saying find something. Okay, at this point, there's generally two types of questions. There are sample size questions and there are confidence interval questions. Sample size, the question is going to boil down to how many fill in the blanks should I have in my study? And then the confidence interval questions will say point blank, construct a confidence interval. Okay, it will say those words. Okay, and then below here, it kind of broke down all the different options of what you're going to be looking at. Okay, so let's look at this first problem here on the left. Okay, so it says in a recent year, the standard deviation of ACT scores for all students. Okay, so that is important. Okay, right here, the fact that we are looking at a standard deviation for all students. That word all there is very, very important. Okay, so reading no further into the problem, just because they said we have a standard deviation for all students, then we know right off the bat that we have a sigma of 4.7. And that's tricky, okay, but don't, look at the whole problem, do it one sentence at a time, okay? Then we take a sample of 20 students, okay, 20 students right here, that's a sample size. From those 20 students, we have this data. Assume that the test scores are normally distributed. Calculate, not calculated, the 90% confidence interval for the population average ACT score. So in other words, here's a sample. Use it to guess something about the population. So looking at our flow chart over here, it's not a sample size problem. It's not a how many. We know it's a confidence interval problem. Then you should decide, is it an average problem or is it a proportion problem? Okay, average problems are going to have standard deviations. Okay, they're going to use the word average in it. So looking at this, some clues that this is an average problem is the fact that there's a standard deviation. Also the fact that it says the word average in this statement right here. Okay, so because of that, we know it's an average problem. So we're on the left-hand side of this flow here. Okay. We either have a one sample problem or we have a two sample problem. At this point in the course, we've only done the one sample, but still get into that mindset. If it's a one sample problem, you have to decide between a Z interval or a T interval. A Z interval you use if you have a sigma. If they told you you have a sigma, a standard deviation for all. If you don't have the standard deviation for all, and instead you just have a sample standard deviation, so in other words, you have an S, you're going to use a T interval. Okay, cut and dry there. If you have sigma, you use Z. If you have S, you use T. Okay, with one small exception here. Okay, we know from the central limit theorem that if you have a sample size larger than 30, then you are looking at a normal distribution. It's guaranteed. It kind of de facto becomes a normal distribution if you have a large enough sample size. Okay, and then in that case, you can use your standard deviation as an approximation for sigma. So in other words, if you have a sample size larger than 30, it is going to bump you back into the Z interval. Okay, so if you have a sigma, you use Z interval. If you don't have a sigma, you use T interval unless the sample size is bigger than 30, and in that case, you would use the Z interval again. Okay, so look at this problem. Realize the fact that we do have a sigma given to us of 4.7. Okay, and I'm going to let you make that decision between which one of these two guys it's going to be. Okay, it's all based on the standard deviation. Again, I'm just going to give you some guidance for the worksheet. I'm not going to actually do the problems here. Okay, number 2, you ask a random sample of 200 people. So we have a sample size. Whether they're in favor of outlawing cigarettes. Of the 200 people, 54 are in favor of outlawing cigarettes. Okay, the letter here varies a little bit. Sometimes we see X, or sometimes we see R. Either way, it's the number of successes. I'm going to write either one because I want you to be familiar with both. And then you're going to find a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of people in the US who are in favor of outlawing cigarettes. So on our flow chart, we know it's saying build a confidence interval. So now we have to make this decision. Is it an average problem or is it a proportion problem? The clue here is it says proportion. Another clue is we don't have any standard deviation. Okay, standard deviation is a dead giveaway that you're looking at an average problem. So because it says the word proportion and there are no reference to averages or proportions, we're going to go to the right. It's a proportion problem, and it's either going to be a 1 prop Z interval or a 2 prop Z interval. 1 prop is if you're only looking at 1 sample of data. 2 is if you're looking at 2 samples of data. So you have to make the decision between which one of those 2 you should use. Okay, and then you should enter it into the calculator. All right, number 3, we're looking at a random sample of 10 regions. So we have a sample size of 10 in New England, and we're looking at violent crime rates per million population. So we have 10 data values there. And then it says, find the 85% confidence interval for the average violent crime rate in New England states. So looking at our flow chart, yes, it's asking for confidence interval. You have to decide, is this an average problem or a proportion problem? Okay, some clues that I look at the question. Okay, come down to the question. Find the confidence interval for the average. It says the word average in there. Okay, doesn't say the word proportion anywhere. Okay, now it doesn't have a standard deviation. You know, for me, that's a dead giveaway. That's an average problem. However, it does say the word average. So we do know in the flow chart, I'm coming here to the left, it's an average problem. Then I have to think, is this a 1 sample problem or a 2 sample problem? We only have 1 set of data. So now I have to decide between a Z interval and a T interval. Okay, now to reiterate what I said before, Z interval is if you are given a standard deviation for all. So in this case, like if they had said the standard deviation for all the regions in New England is blah, that would be a sigma, and you would use a Z interval. Okay, they would have to point blank tell you the standard deviation for all. Otherwise, you don't know sigma, so you know S, and if you have an S, you use a T interval, unless your sample size is large, bigger than 30. Then that would bump you back into the Z interval. But in this case, we only have a sample of 10. Okay, so you have to make that decision between Z interval and T interval. Once you make that decision, you would write that down, enter the values into the calculator, and it will calculate the interval for you. Okay, so far so good. Number 4, the standard deviation for the distribution of plasma volume in all male firefighters is 7.50 milliliters per kilogram. Find the sample size necessary. Okay, this problem is very different than what we just saw in the earlier problems. Okay, nowhere does it say find a confidence interval. It does say the word confidence, but it doesn't say find a confidence interval. Okay, This problem is a sample size problem. It's saying how many people should I have in my study? Okay, so on our flow chart, we're here under sample size, and these are our 3 sample size formulas. Okay, if it's an average problem, you're going to go to the left and you're going to use this formula here. If it's a proportion problem, we have these 2 options here. Okay. In all of these, there's this Z sub C. It's a critical Z score. And that critical Z score is found, let's see if I have it opened up here. I don't think I do. It's found on our Z tables. So if you open up the Z tables, the normal and T interval, or normal and T tables, that is the first link under the Chapter 8 videos. If you open that up, I would print that off so that you can use that. It's 3 pages long. On the second page, on the bottom left-hand corner, there's this little table. It's not very large, and it says, I think it's confidence interval critical values. I have a hard copy. Let me just glance at that and make sure I had the right verbiage. Yeah, it's table B, bottom left-hand corner, and it's confidence interval critical values. And when you go to that table, you look up your level of confidence that they want you to find, and then it has a critical Z score that you would just pick off the chart and then use in that formula. Okay, so sample size, these are the 3 formulas. Use this guy on the left if it's an average problem. This guy on the right, these are the proportion formulas. If at all possible, you want to use the bottom formula. But to use the bottom formula, that p-value, an estimate for p, has to be given. If you have no estimate for p, then you're stuck using this top formula. Okay? So I don't want to give away which one of these 3 to use, but it is one of those 3 formulas. And my further hint is that it says the word mean right there. Okay? So you would use one of these formulas and then fill in the values appropriately. Okay, I think I've done now one of each type of problem, kind of giving you a little bit of guidance about how to attack the problem. So there is a sample size example, and then there were some Z interval, T interval, and a 1-prop Z interval in there. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance of how to kind of approach the problem. I would have this flowchart if I were you. I would print this flowchart off. I think it helps students kind of guide their thought process in this chapter. Okay, and it kind of lays out the whole chapter here, because after this we're going to go to 2 samples. And then also make sure you print off that Z table, because you're going to need that, especially right here, to fill in these Z scores. Okay, so hopefully that helps you out. If you have further questions, please let me know. Good luck.